Welcome to video 24 in the Calmness in Mind series, where we'll be discussing how and why it is an effective process to examine your attitudes when you're looking to shake off anxiety. I looked up the word attitude and it said an established and settled way of thinking or feeling about someone or something, typically that is reflected in the person's behavior. So modifying one's attitudes are a great way to begin to reprogram the brain and the body into new responses that can foster more calmness and choice in any moment. Because let's face it, respectfully, how you've been thinking, feeling, and your existing attitudes, even if they're seemingly important to you, have been contributing to your emotional agitation. Now, in my experience as a therapist, many people make the assumption that who they are, how they are, their attitudes, their view of the world, it's sort of something that's already established, or it's just one of those things, or I'm shy, or dull, or I'm clumsy, or I'm just an anxious person. And I'm here to continue trying to convince you that this is not necessarily true. You were once a blank canvas, relatively. You were programmed, by parents, culture, school, religion, and through life's events into being who you've become now. And because you once were programmed, there is no reason to doubt that you can't reprogram yourself into a new person, given that you experience new inputs, repetition, surrendering any old stories you have about yourself, and developing a new, more appropriate identity in the now for the future self that you wish to become. In reality, it happens all the time. Common phrases that we hear are, or they were brainwashed. She returned from rehabilitation a new person. He left home a boy and returned a man. Being in that relationship has brought out the best in him. I didn't know she had it in her to step up like that, The way he adapted after that accident has been inspirational. We can change. It's not easy. It doesn't just happen, We have to make it happen. And that's why I have been presenting you with so many models to describe how we humans operate, and why I've been asking you to consider who you want to be and what you want from life. Now, I'm not silly. I'm aware that this work is challenging. It's really difficult. And this is why I tell lots of stories. It's why I use metaphors, concepts, ideas, hoping that in any way I can kind of inspire you. But the best examples I can give are clearly from my own actions, which guided me out of anxiety and depression into calmness and optimism. Because experientially, they worked. Therefore, I know them to be true for me. So in this video, I will make myself vulnerable. I'm going to bare my soul, and I'm going to discuss with you the inner workings of my mind, how I see life, and the tools I use each day to manage my own mental health. So, it's your mission, should you wish to accept it, to discover ways of adapting my methodologies into processes that can work for you. But you'll need to keep an open mind. You'll need to put doubt on hold, and you'll need to take action, even if it feels strange and even if it feels awkward. Because we're trying new things. Just to see what happens. We're examining the truth of who we think we really are. So it wasn't until I was 35 that I began to explore any of this work. I was depressed, anxious, I was exhausted, and I was trying to hide these emotions from everybody around me. Inside, I felt alienated, confused, broken. I had no idea of who I was or what I wanted. And at that time, I could see no way out of the difficulty of just being me. Now, sadly, this led into a 6-month nervous breakdown where I couldn't work. I spent most of my day in bed, and I could see no path to recovery. I felt that I was a failure. okay? And I truly thought that my world had ended and that there was no way out of it. I mean, obviously looking back on it, it was actually the start of my new life, and really just the end of me tormenting myself with anxiety and OCD. Or I suppose you could say it was the end of me torturing myself via my excessive thoughts and my overwhelming emotions. I was slowly waking up to the fact that the world inside my head, which controlled my emotions and my attitudes, was completely different from the world outside of my head, like I discussed in video number 17. And I needed strategies for each of those two worlds, the inner world and the outer world. Yeah? I could change my attitudes, my perspectives, the stories I had about this and that, and I could try and align with my true nature, whatever that true nature was, or whoever that true nature was, rather than aligning with the domestic idea and a domesticated thinking of who I thought I was. So it was abruptly revealed to me in those times just how programmed I'd been to follow rules, to be good, to do the right thing, to get a job, to buy a house, to get married, have kids, be nice, work hard, and save for my retirement. It just dawned on me, okay, that just because that's what other people did, okay, it didn't mean that I had to do it as well. And looking back on it, that the magnitude of how I'd been brainwashed by school, parents, TV, cultures, books, and a thousand other sources opened my eyes to the hypnotic trance that I'd been living in for years, and that everybody around me has been living in as well. I had been programmed, and I recognized clearly that if I wanted to be calm and I wanted to be happy, that was my responsibility, nobody else's, okay? And that I would need to install new software into the hardware of my brain. So what I'd like to do is to describe the top realizations I had and teach you some of the techniques, attitudes, and perspectives I used to turn my ship around, okay? And that I still use today to keep myself as emotionally healthy as I possibly can be. Now, one crucial attitude change was I stopped blindly following rules or worrying about whether what I was doing was right or wrong, good or bad. Instead, I asked myself, would I be okay with the worst consequences that could arise due to my action or my inaction in that moment? Because if I was okay with that worst consequence happening, then surely it was okay to take that risk. Because rarely does the worst thing seem to happen anyway, and if it did, even if I didn't like it, I could handle it. Sometimes what we think is the worst outcome turns out to be a wonderful thing, if we add a little time. Like being devastated by being made redundant from a job, only to luck into another job 6 months later that was better than we could have ever dreamed of. This was a significant shift in perspective for me, because I'd been deeply programmed by my family to follow rules, to fit in, and of course to respect authority. One night, soon after I decided to change my attitudes, I made the conscious decision to drive my car the wrong way down a one-way street late at night when there was very little traffic, to save myself from getting caught up in some street closures due to overnight roadworks. And I actually said to myself consciously, what's the worst thing that could happen, assuming that I drive slowly and safely? And my mind came up with the idea to be stopped by the police and to be fined, and then perhaps to receive an endorsement on my driving license. And in that late night, empty road situation, I consciously decided that I was okay with that. I could afford to pay the fine, and I had a clean license, so there was room for a few points. Okay, I was an adult, so I was okay with the worst thing that could happen, even if my little 8-year-old and my body wasn't. So I did it. I broke the law. I drove the wrong way down the road, okay, thus avoiding a lengthy delay and stopped me getting caught up in all the roadworks. I got to be honest with you, it felt good. It was exciting. It saved a lot of time and it made sense. And then moments later, I was pulled over by a policeman who'd seen me do it. And he said he'd been stopping motorists all night who'd been doing the same thing. And when he asked me why I'd done it, I answered truthfully. I said, I know it's stupid, but I'd weighed up the dangers and I was okay with the consequences. Therefore, there's no excuses from me. And whatever action he wanted to take to punish me, that's okay. I'll take it on the chin. And he just smiled and said, you're the first driver tonight to tell me the truth and to politely accept responsibility for your actions. Everybody else has given me a sob story about being late or not realizing what they're doing, and they've all tried to talk me out of giving them a ticket. And he just smiled. He told me I was an idiot, and he let me go with no punishment at all. So even though my worst fear had happened, there still wasn't a real consequence, even though I would have been okay with it anyway. The world so rarely responds the way our minds and our egos tell us that it will. Plus, how we behave in any moment may influence, to some degree, what eventually happens to us next. Now, obviously, I'm not condoning my behavior in that moment, and I'm not saying that you should break rules, okay? But it's an interesting illustration of the point that I'm trying to make. To me now, rules aren't a real thing. They are just a set of commands that may have consequences if you break them. And if you're not okay with the consequences, then don't break them, okay? There are rules of nature, rules of physics. However, laws made by man are often made to support or control the masses, and not common sense in every instance, okay? I think the pandemic may be testimony to that statement. You can decide at any moment if it's in your interest to follow them or not. But be aware that some rules are not rules. They may be cultural or family patterns. You don't have to be nice or good, okay? You don't have to help everybody. You can say no. And I think this is an often overlooked component of anxiety, is the pressure placed upon an individual from their family or their peer group to fit in or to behave or perform in a certain way to keep the whole group happy. In recent months, I've seen dozens of incidents where anxious individuals have become deeply distressed by wanting to behave in one certain way, okay, within the pandemic, but have acquiesced to the wishes of more dominant family members via threats or like, unless you do X, Y, Z, we won't let you visit us. Or unless you do ABC, we won't be attending your wedding. And therefore they sacrifice their own truth or their own values to please other people. Now, it's not for this video, okay, but it's been clearly proven that for those looking to change themselves, their environment, their families, and the people they spend time with influence the degree to which they will be able to change more powerfully than their own willpower. So to increase your willpower, you may also need to remove yourself from toxic or controlling people, or at the very least, update their virtual reality story of you through new behaviors, or put boundaries in place to protect them from you, or maybe even from you from them. And I'll be making a video or two about that process. So let's go back to attitudes, okay? These days, my attitudes tend towards behaviors and thoughts which lead to my calmness, contentment, and happiness, okay? And my life having direction, purpose, and meaning. These days, I have attitudes that allow me to like myself, okay? I decided to foster these attitudes, and I started to decide to be nice to myself by stopping being horrible to myself. I am kind to myself in my actions and in my own mind. I manage my energy. I embrace creativity. I feel courageous, truthful. You know, I have clear intentions of what I want to achieve, okay? And these are all attitudes that I consciously chose to pick and I consciously chose to adopt. Now, this took me 10 years to do. You know, there was a lot of disruption. Lots of things had to change. People, locations, beliefs, my profession, the story I had about who I was. Many things had to be dismantled before they could be rebuilt in new ways. You don't make an omelette without breaking lots of eggs. Anxiety, OCD, and depression don't just go away, but they may lift if your living environment gets easier or if you avoid change. But that's not recovery. Proper recovery arises as you live life differently, as you become a new person who thinks and acts in new ways. So let me delve further inside my head and explore ways of looking at things differently. Now bear in mind, I started this 20 years ago, okay, when there was no YouTube videos and there wasn't many good self-help books around. And of course, these days, people are pretty clued up about the mind and the body connection and about intelligent ways of looking at themselves and life. But I'm going to still keep going back to basics, because all it takes is one little aha moment, and then you might have a considerable shift in your awareness of who you are, what you want, and what's going on inside yourself. Now, one of my earliest realizations was about my mind and the thoughts inside my head. All my life, I had experienced a busy internal dialogue. It was really noisy. It was judgmental. It was fearful. It would catastrophize about everything. It was constantly analyzing everything, commenting on everything, telling me what to do, telling me what to be afraid of, and reminding me all day long of my limitations, all the things that could go wrong, how useless I was, and it was guessing what everybody else was thinking about me. And back then, if someone had said, "What's that voice in your head? What's that inner dialogue?" I'd have said, "It's me," okay? And it honestly never crossed my mind that they were just the musings of my brain, you know, and that I could ignore them, okay? And because I thought that they were me, I would argue with them. I would try to understand them. I would keep asking why, and I would battle with them to try and stop them, which of course made everything worse. And the technique that really changed things for me, and I detailed it in video 13, was I learned as the observer to associate each of my thoughts to an imaginary character in my brain. But of course, these characters were of the brain and not me. There was like a narrator who would just talk all day long telling me what was going on out there. And then there was the judge, okay? And then there was the victim and the pleaser and the self-conscious one and a dominant one, and so on and on. And each time a thought came up, I would observe it. I would listen to its message. And then I would associate it back to which character I would imagine that it had come from, okay? And it didn't take long before I had mapped out a whole list of characters who all seemed to have differing strategies for me. And very quickly I saw that each time my rebel said something like, "Oh, that would be fun," then the judge would come in and say, "Don't be silly." And then the victim would come up and say, "Well, you look stupid if you do that." And then the worrying guy would come along and say, "Well, what would go wrong if I did any of those things?" Okay. And it just took me about 2 weeks to realize there's this whole soap opera going on in my head, in my mind, or in the brain's mind, that up until then I'd been addicted to watching, and worse, I was a part of. You know, I thought it was me, but it wasn't. It was the brain's mind, and I was the observer, the rider of the horse, as I keep bringing it back to. And through silently observing them, it became clear that they were just little kids. Their stories were my stories at that age. My brain had adopted those perspectives back then, and it hadn't updated them. A few years back, I watched a Disney film called Inside Out that animates all the voices inside a young girl's head. And it made me laugh out loud because it was a more friendly, dumbed-down version of how my brain used to be. And if you haven't watched it, I would certainly advise you to go and take a look. It's very clever, and it's very, very accurate. So, off the back of this one simple technique, I had consciously detached myself from the unconscious, okay, and all of those out-of-date musings of my mind. And because I could see how childish and contradictory all those thoughts were, I could see that they weren't the truth of what I should do. They were just fearful little children trying to stop me from doing things. They thought safety was to avoid or control things, okay? And I had thought that they were me. I realized that I didn't have to give them any attention. And so my new intention was to retrain myself to ignore them, you know, to place my conscious awareness somewhere else, as I've been saying over and over again. And it consciously dawned on me that the words safety and security had been entirely misunderstood by my brain, and it was unconsciously and automatically running strategies that imprisoned me. Like a long-term prisoner, preferring the familiarity and the perceived security of a prison rather than having the responsibility of being free and having to face life in new ways. My OCD had become my familiar prison, the comfort of my routines, the predictability, the cleanliness of my home, the staying in rather than going out, talking myself out of doing things rather than talking myself into doing them. It felt safe, but it wasn't a good kind of safe. Now, this realization really shocked me, and it became clear that my perceived need for safety, or you might say my brain's conditioned need for security, was at the heart of my problem. Somehow, the question dawned upon me that if I had a magic wand and I could go back into my childhood and I could reprogram my brain, what would I reprogram it into? And I think this is an interesting question to ask yourself. So I started by examining what I thought safety was. And the answers that came up were quite interesting. When I said to my brain, what is safety? It would say things like, to not feel anxious, to not look silly, to not look like you're going mad, to not be judged in bad ways, to not show vulnerability, to not fail, to not break all the rules, to fit in, to not let people down. And it kept coming up with statements like that. Once again, this really shocked me, as what it seemed I feared were my own emotions, what others would think of me, and how I would use all those thoughts and feelings to beat myself up and reject myself. They were the fears of a child. But of course they were. Of course they were, because they were the programs that I'd set up in my brain all those years ago when I was a child, and they were still running the show unconsciously, although I was living consciously as an adult. I hope this is making sense. I figured that rather than attempt to redefine what safety was, I ought to explore what was the opposite of safety, what was the opposite of security. I needed to flip that old story and see what attitudes I would need to develop to become more comfortable with them. Phrases like danger, risk, being out of control, embarrassment, being the center of attention, taking responsibility, trying new things, failing, putting myself first, saying what I thought, standing up for myself, exploration, adventure, and things like that. And as I was sort of thinking of all these things of what was the opposite, of course it kicked off all the old fear programs inside of me, okay? But there was another little voice too in the background. Maybe my rebel, maybe my adult, I don't know. But with hindsight, okay, I could see that it was my warrior and my nomad. And they were both saying, yes, please, we would like some of that. We're sick of all this stuff. And it had been the conditioning of my settler unconsciously driving my actions and my fears for so long that it had become the loudest and the most fearful voice within me. My warrior wanted action and to achieve something, wanted me to plan, okay, to speak my mind, to move forwards, to move towards my goals, to stop caring if I was liked, and for me to ignore any negative emotions that got in the way of taking action. And my nomad wanted more fun, excitement, to be spontaneous, out of control, to try new things, travel, adventure, break some rules, make connections, and to be able to experience the whole range of emotions, from anger to danger to love. Okay, they're just emotions, and they're fun and they're exciting. All of those behaviors could only be realized if I had a new set of attitudes, maybe even different attitudes for each of my characters. So that's what I did. I started looking at these things. So the next question that came up was, therefore, how could I redefine my old stories, my values and my beliefs about safety that were pulling me away from life into new attitudes that will take me out into life? How could I change my relationship with my emotions? How could I accept them rather than avoid them? How could I stop giving them any meaning? How could I consistently be nice to myself? How could I be okay doing anything, regardless of what the mind thought or how the body felt, as long as that action took my life in the direction I wanted it to go, irrespective of the outcome of that action? Because if I could constantly adjust my behaviors to suit what outcome did happen, then at least I was doing something rather than procrastinating or waiting for life to change by itself, which, by the way, rarely happens. Now, the answer I found was very unexpected, and it became the foundation of my horse and rider metaphor. I read in a book about the author's description of how she looked at the world. And although I'd heard her story many times before, this particular time it registered deep within myself in a completely new way. She said something along the lines of, we are immortal, formless energies. Perhaps you could say a soul. And we're here on earth in a mortal body to experience what it's like to have the physical form of a body. She said, as a formless soul, we can't feel pain or grief or anger, rejection, loss, and the myriad of other human bodily emotions. As a soul, we don't have an ego, the protective personality, the childhood programming of the body's brain that tries to talk us out of doing things or worries what other people think about us. And she said, therefore, Earth School is the perfect place for us as a soul to learn how to transform the body's fear of emotions and rise above the programmed directives of the childlike ego. We can, as the rider, transcend these fears, and in doing so, totally reprogram our horse, which is the vehicle for our adventure. That way, when we return to the universe, or wherever our formless energy returns to, we are a wiser entity. We have more value. Perhaps we can move up to the next level. Or perhaps we may need to come back down again because we missed the point of what we were supposed to do in that last lifetime. Now, I'm not saying this is true. I don't know, it might be, who knows? And even if somebody did know, who'd actually believe them? It can't be proven. Okay? But then again, who can prove what love is, or integrity, or kindness, or happiness? No one can prove what they really are. And the trouble with anxiety, OCD, and depression is, to some degree, is the person experiencing them needs proof. They want to know what's true. They want explanations, and they want the data to reassure themselves with. They want the person helping them to be an expert, a doctor, a scientist, a professor, a religious leader, okay? Because then there'll be the perception of evidence and proof. But there is no proof of what these things are, yeah? How they work, or how to fix them. The definition of OCD is via the grouping of their symptoms, giving the condition a name. And then doctors work mainly on treating the symptoms rather than addressing the cause. They try to calm the body with beta blockers. They try to quieten the mind with antipsychotics, or they try to raise the person's mood with antidepressants. Yeah, that they might help, but nothing changed in the individual. Their body is still afraid of emotions, and their minds are still addicted to worrying. Now, at that time, I didn't believe in God or souls. I really wanted to, okay? But as a logical, rational engineer, there just wasn't enough energy. There just wasn't enough proof for me, okay? Not enough evidence. But something clicked inside my brain, and it dawned on me that even if this soul having a human experience to learn how to grow wasn't true to me, it was still an excellent model or a good metaphor that I could use to choose to live my life by. It just really made sense on so many levels to learn how to rise above fear, to discover that thoughts don't have to mean anything, to find the courage to start new things, to learn how to detach from pain, to not need external validation because you began to validate yourself. Even if you failed at something, you were still nice to yourself. To be able to accept other people, to become beneficial to society, to become a good role model, to become creative, to be able to follow your own dreams. This way of looking at life offered me other benefits too. Okay, the first was regarding death. Now, once again, I don't know what will happen when you die, but I do like the idea that my soul would survive and it would move on, though the body would certainly expire. Therefore, I chose to make that my belief. Or you could say I chose that to become the attitude that I adopted. And a quick note here, I don't think a belief needs to be true. I think it's just a story or an idea that you choose to align yourself with. I would rather believe my relatives who have died are safe somewhere than dust or buried in a box. Okay? Why? Because it makes me feel better. Can you see that we can fib to ourselves? We can adjust the truth. And why not? You know, do you want to be right or do you want to be happy? So I consciously changed my unconscious story about fearing dying into a more helpful story about fearing not living, okay, and not optimizing the use of my body while I'm lucky enough to have one. And because I'm not a body, I inhabit a body, it'll be okay when it's time for me to leave this body when it's outworn. Now, a big driver for this was my godmother, who lived alone in her house towards the end of her life. Okay, and as she became less mobile, she also watched TV less, she read less, and she would often just sit looking out of her living room window, watching the world passing by. And I said to her one day, "Don't you get bored?" And she said, "No, not really. I'm blessed to have so many friends that pop in and they keep me company, and I'm happy to watch the children wander by with all their playful optimism, you know, all their lives ahead of them. It's okay." And she went on to say, "I'm not afraid to die. My bags are packed. I'm really looking forward to meeting up again with my husband soon enough." And then she said something that truly inspired me. And she said, "Best of all, I have my memories. My life was so varied, it was exciting, it was fun. Okay, we traveled to so many places, we had interesting jobs, beautiful holidays, we played sports, you know, we created a lovely home and a garden, we hung out with wonderful friends." She said, "I have no regrets, okay, and I have 1,000 beautiful memories to keep me company in this last phase of my life." And she said, "I couldn't imagine what it would be like to be here now if I had regrets, or if I was berating myself for not having sampled the richness of life." She said, "That indeed would be hell on earth." And that really touched me. And in that moment, you know, right there and then, I promised myself that I would start saying yes to everything, that I would stop procrastinating, and I would reprogram my attitudes to fear not living rather than worrying about dying or pain or problems. And the second way of looking at life that sprung up, that really surprised me, was that if the world was perfect, if there was no poverty, no disease, no juxtaposition between good and bad, right and wrong, no wars, good governments, no death, and if we all lived in perfect harmony, how could we grow? There would be no pain for us to transcend. There would be no conflicts to rise above. You know, there would be no reason to be here. And if there was a God, I don't know if there is, but if there was a God, he would need to make us another planet somewhere else, which was disruptive, so that we could be sent to that, so we'd have an environment conducive to our emotional growth. Now, this realization, regardless of its truth, really resonated with me, okay, as a way to see the world, okay, and my role within it. It gave me a model to use, okay? It's not my job to save the world. It's my job to learn to be okay with it, to calmly navigate my way through it. Yes, I'm developing this course, but it's not my job to fix you. That's your job, you know? It's not my job to end anxiety or OCD, just to make a resource. And if somebody wants to take that resource, good for them. And if they want to do it, that's fine. I would rather sustainably visit the rainforest and first-hand experience its beauty and spend time living and learning from the indigenous inhabitants, rather than angrily demonstrating, campaigning and fighting corporations against its destruction. I want to experience life rather than try to control it. Plus, if I can gain these experiential experiences, it gives me far broader, more inclusive perspectives that I can bring into my life. Now, once again, I'm not saying this is right or wrong, and I'm not telling you what you should do. I'm opening up and sharing with you what points of view and what beliefs work for me, okay? I stopped fighting life. I stopped fighting corporations, governments, systems, and rules. And gently, but with courage, I have done what is suitable for my growth, my happiness, and my calmness. Now, some might call this attitude selfish. In my childhood, I've been programmed to see selfish as a bad word. Stop being so selfish. It's not all about you. Things like that, you know. And now I can see that it is all about me. I am the center of my universe. How could it be any other way? My life is all about me. And the happier I become and the more energy I have allows me to be there for those who I choose to have around me. The attitude I chose was the phrase to be selflessly selfish. I'm happy to do anything for anybody, including myself, if it feels right for me in that moment. And if it doesn't, well, then I just say no. I don't feel bad about that. Selflessly selfish works for me. I also talk a lot about the book, The Four Agreements. And I really would love you to read it or listen to the recording. And for 6 months, I borrowed those 4 rules to live my life by, to decide how I would act in any moment, thinking that I would then replace those 4 agreements with my new values and my new beliefs once I'd experienced all these new behaviors. However, they worked out just fine on their own. I learned that nothing anybody says or does was personal, okay, and to stop making it so. That's a simple rule, but people don't see the depth of that. I learned to stop making assumptions and ask people for facts, okay. I learned to speak with integrity to others and to myself inside my head. I learned to do my best in each moment, but to accept that my best was a variable dependent on the circumstances that I found myself in. If I only had 10 minutes, well, this is the best I could do in 10 minutes. And there's a 5th agreement too, and that is to be skeptical, but to listen anyway. We can always grow, okay? We can always learn more, yet sometimes not everything we hear or read is true, okay? You know, we're mistaken, though sometimes we just don't see it, okay? OCD makes you doubt everything, and your ego makes you cling to what you currently believe to be true, right? But is that the only truth? You know? So what if this planet is Earth school? The perfect place for a soul to inhabit a body, okay? It's the perfect place that we're so messed up that it will always provide a continuous set of challenges for the rider to navigate the horse through on their journey to become their highest self. To learn calmness, choice, and to avoid the emotional duality of right and wrong, good and bad, safe and dangerous. To accept things are as they are. And in any moment, you can choose your course of action, whatever is right for you in that moment. And how will you know what that course of action will be until that moment arises? Can you see that as an engineer, I'm trying to give you models to use that create a framework from which you can decide what perspectives you will look at things from, okay? And what new attitudes may be worth adopting as you ride out into your life. So, as I begin to conclude this video about attitudes, let me list some of the significant shifts that really work for me. And remember, I'm telling you about myself here, okay? You've got to find things that work for you. I had always been a very poor sleeper with lots of insomnia, and my relationship with sleep was very unhealthy. I hated it, I went to bed late, and I despised laying awake for hours and hours and on every night. However, as part of my new attitude system, as part of loving myself and my body, I created a new attitude towards sleep and rest. Like food and water, sleep was essential, not only to life, but to me recharging my emotional battery, which I talk about in video number 4. So I started a new relationship with sleep. I started new sleep routines by being in bed by 11 and getting up at 7. I blacked out my room with the blackout blinds, okay? I stopped having any technology or distractions inside the bedroom, okay? And if I was awake at night, I would meditate, or I would try to release trapped trauma. So even if I wasn't sleeping, I was resting and growing. And this was fundamentally a new attitude, and one that made a massive difference to my recovery. Let me give you another attitude change. I consciously decided that I wanted my body weight to be more important to me than enjoying food. Okay? My logic being that I could enjoy my body all day if it were healthy and my clothes felt good, whereas food was only enjoyable for short periods of time. You know? I could feel good about my body all day long. And to do this, I had to change my attitude from I'm missing out on nice food to I'm gaining a slim and healthy body. You know, that was hard to do, but it was really worth it. It was a massive change of attitude. I changed my attitude towards guilt and realized that guilt was a choice. And often it was self-abusive because nobody was asking me to feel bad. And even if they were asking me to feel bad, I didn't have to take it personally. It was just their opinion. I saw that guilt was just the difference between what I did and what my mind thought I ought to do or not do. So I just stopped listening to my mind, okay, and just did what was suitable to me in any particular moment. My attitude towards guilt became, I won't abuse myself in that way. And even if others try to guilt me, I won't guilt myself. I chose to change my old OCD story, okay, about needing to be in control and wanting to know what would happen next, to that of really accepting that there is only now. As I talk about in video 10, it's always now. So I developed, with a lot of struggle and with a lot of repetition, a whole new attitude to live in the now, to stay out of my mind's what-if stories about the future and its if-only stories about the past, which of course are just virtual reality stories. They're not real. To decide the best action in this now for me, one that will take me and take my life in the direction I want it to go. And this led neatly into another new attitude, to be courageous, which is, as I've said 100 times, is just feeling vulnerable, but taking action anyway. I feel vulnerable telling you about all the things inside my head, but I'm taking action anyway. And let's just end this video with one final conscious attitude shift that I made. I decided, okay, to consciously develop the habit of positively talking myself into doing things that I knew were good for my life, rather than my old anxiety pattern of talking myself out of doing things, which we might call avoidance. When my unconscious mind said that will never work, I would consciously start a new dialogue, overwriting the old one, saying things like, I'm looking forward to starting that new project. I'm so happy that I will go and clean that drain now. Okay, it would be good to resolve that problem with my neighbour, which of course is also setting up an attitude of consistently talking positively about all the things that I want to be doing in my life, and it's setting up new intentions, which then reprogram the RAS part of my unconscious brain, whose job it is to help us to achieve our goals, which is what I explained to you in video 18. So, your homework. My personal experience proved to me that tremendous changes are possible when you stop identifying with your thoughts, okay? You stop identifying with your feelings and your old identities that you may have about yourself. And don't get caught up in the logical definition of words, okay? I'm talking here about values or beliefs or attitudes or intentions or goals. It doesn't really matter what word you use, just sort of take yourself down a path of using words that will take you forward rather than calling them a belief or a value or an intention. They're just words. Don't get caught up in words. What matters is if your life, thoughts and behaviors are leaving you exhausted, anxious or depressed, and if your life has no direction, purpose or meaning, then something needs to change. So, Can you write down all the stories, attitudes, and behaviors that are currently dominating your life? Right. Can you go back and watch video 21? Because that will certainly help you to do this, okay? Do you remember how we explored anxiety loops and then flipped them over into new, more positive behaviors? I would like you to stop clinging to the same old stories. I'd like you to stop behaving in the same old ways. I would like you to reverse your stories. Rather than thinking about safety, how can you explore excitement? Rather than thinking about guilt, how can you explore selfishness? Instead of following rules, how can you explore consequences? So, can you get out some paper and start writing these things down? Make a mind map, however you want to document all these things, okay? Find a way that you can capture all this information in a way that works for you. And as you go to do this, I'd like you to observe what comes up, okay? Because anxiety and OCD will try to talk you out of it. They will try to sabotage you. They'll be saying, oh, haven't got enough time to do this, or you tried that before, or whatever, do that next week. This is sabotage in action. Get a piece of paper, write it all down. Ignore them, okay? Just get on with it, okay? We might call that an attitude of not waiting for motivation and just seizing every moment and realizing it's always now, and it's what you do in this now that changes your life. Now, I've shared some of the high-level models that I choose to live by, even though I can't prove them to be true, and even though I don't fully believe them, they work for me as a model, and that's good enough for me. So ask yourself, what high-level models might you adopt, or who around you has a way of being that you admire and that you could copy? Can you ask them how they see the world, how they motivate themselves? Could you try my model on for size? You know, the soul inhabiting a body, okay? Have a think about it, play around with it, okay? Or perhaps you can adapt your existing belief in some more productive way. And finally, who or what in your environment is overpowering your willpower or stopping you from changing your life? A dependent relative, a judgmental parent, a critical partner, okay, a controlling child, an unhealthy inner dialogue, an untidy house, an unhealthy body. What unnecessary distractions do you use, okay, to pull yourself away from life? Computer games, zoning out on weed, helping others instead of helping yourself, going to bed late, obsessing on study rather than starting work, acting like a victim rather than courageously taking action. I like the phrase, where your attention goes, your energy flows, okay? And one last thought. If you are saying to yourself, once I get over OCD, then I'll go and do X, Y, Z, this is an OCD trap, okay? You need to start doing X, Y, Z now while you have OCD. Fake it till you make it. This is proper exposure therapy in action, okay? And there is no better cure than just using life as an antidote to OCD. How can you courageously ride your frightened little horsey out into the world with a whole new set of attitudes just to see what will happen? Vulnerability with action, regardless of the outcome, and regardless of how you feel, and regardless of what your mind is thinking, is courage in action. How can you keep positively talking yourself into what you do want to do, not what you don't want to do? I know there's a lot of information here, okay? But it's coming from my soul, and these are the techniques that I use, and they've worked, okay? Thanks for all your support. Keep up the great work. And until the next video, let's get working on these attitudes. Thanks a lot.